Hello everyone, I am Horror Horizon, and I am here to help you today. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you watching right now? Get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into a story that might just keep you awake tonight. If you have any horror story that has happened to you, please email us.
Lisa and Mark had always dreamed of leaving behind the noisy, crowded city. The constant hum of traffic, the flashing lights, it had all begun to wear them down. They longed for something quieter, something simpler. So, when they found an old house on the outskirts of town, they jumped at the chance. It was perfecto, or at least, it seemed perfect at first. A large garden for their 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, to run in. Spacious rooms. The kind of place that seemed to whisper comfort. Or was it secrets? The house was old, but charming. It had that classic, time-worn feel that one might expect from a place that had seen many years come and go. Creaking wooden floors that groaned underfoot. Faded wallpaper that told stories of decades long gone. The type of house that could swallow up sound, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. The air was thick with history, with things unsaid, with things best forgotten. Sophie was thrilled. She ran around the garden, laughing, playing in the sunshine. Lisa and Mark watched her from the window, their hearts swelling with hope. This was the beginning of something new. Something better. A new start for their little family. But, as the days passed, there was a shift in Sophie's behavior. She became quieter. Withdrawn, almost. At first, it was subtly just the occasional glance over her shoulder or a whispered word to herself. But then it got worse. Sophie, usually full of boundless energy and imagination, began to speak of things that unsettled Lisa. Late one evening, as Lisa tucked Sophie into bed, she noticed her daughter's gaze was fixed on the corner of the room, her eyes wide, her face pale. Sophie wasn't looking at anything, but it felt like she was looking at something in the dark, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Sophie? Lisa's voice was soft, trying to break through whatever was consuming her daughter's attention. The little girl didn't turn. Her eyes stayed fixed on that spot, as if some unseen force held her there. "Mama," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling, "there's something under my bed." Lisa paused. The room grew colder. Sophie had always had a vivid imagination, sure, but this felt different. This felt real. "There's nothing under your bed, sweetheart," Lisa reassured her, though her voice was strained. She forced a smile, trying to ease the tension that hung in the air. "It's just your imagination. The house is old, sometimes things creak and groan." But Sophie didn't look reassured. Her gaze moved slowly from the corner to meet her mother's, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was trying to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed like she was afraid to say what she knew. Finally, she whispered, her voice barely audible, "It looks like me." Lisa's heart skipped. She bent down, brushing a lock of Sophie's hair from her face. "What do you mean, sweetie?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, as if considering whether to speak at all. "It's under my bed," she said, her voice shaky. "It's just like me. But it isn't. It watches me when I sleep." A cold shiver ran down Lisa's spine, though she tried her best to ignore it. She forced another smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. "There's nothing there, darling. You're safe. It's just a bad dream." But Sophie only stared at her, her little hands clutching the edges of the blanket, her wide eyes filled with a fear that seemed far too old for a child her age. She whispered again, as if to herself, It's waiting for me. Lisa's throat tightened. She kissed Sophie's forehead, trying to push down the unease gnawing at her. Go to sleep now, sweetheart. Everything's okay. But even as she left the room, that feeling didn't fade. It lingered. Like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, as Lisa lay in bed next to Mark, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. The house creaked, its old bones groaning in the night. Every sound seemed louder than usual, each one echoing in the dark like a distant warning. Lisa stared at the ceiling, the image of Sophie's fearful face playing over and over in her mind. What was happening to her? Mark turned over, groggy from a long day of unpacking. She's just adjusting, he murmured, half asleep. She'll be fine. But Lisa didn't feel fine. Something about the house felt wrong, like it was holding something back. The walls seemed too thick, the air too still. There was something watching them. As the night deepened, Lisa closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. She was just being paranoid. Sophie was fine. It was just an old house, settling in the night. But then, just as she began to drift off, she heard a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Lisa. Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding. She lay still, listening. The house was quiet again, the whisper gone as quickly as it came. But the weight in the air remained. She could almost feel the presence of something just beyond her reach. She glanced over at Mark, still asleep, oblivious to the tension in the room. But Lisa wasn't asleep. She was wide awake, her senses heightened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was 30-something in the dark, just outside of her vision. Something waiting. And as she tried to calm her breathing, she heard it again, a faint, but unmistakable. A whisper. It's under your bed. Lisa lay frozen in bed, her breath caught in her throat. She had heard it. A whisper. So faint, so quiet, like it had been spoken from the very walls of the house. It's under your bed. The room felt impossibly still. The darkness seemed deeper, stretching further than it should. She turned her head slightly, her eyes darting toward Sophie's room just down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, the way Lisa had left it so she could hear if Sophie called for her in the night. But now, staring at that small gap in the darkness, Lisa felt something else. A presence. She glanced at Mark. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and steady. He hadn't heard it. But she had. She swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the sound as a trick of her overtired mind. She had been unpacking all day. Moving was stressful. Maybe she was imagining things. But then a broken bar. A sound. Not a whisper this time. Something small. A shuffle. A movement. Lisa's breath hitched. It came from Sophie's room. She sat up slowly, the bed creaking beneath her. Every muscle in her body felt tense as she listened. Another shuffle. A rustle of fabric. Lisa swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. She hesitated for a moment before pushing herself up. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Step by step, she moved toward Sophie's room, her fingers brushing against the cool wooden walls as she walked down the dim hallway. As she reached the doorway, she heard a tag-a movement from under Sophie's bed. Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears. She inhaled sharply and pushed the door open further. Sophie was in bed, her small frame curled beneath the blankets. Her back was to the door, her little shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was asleep. But Lisa's eyes drifted downward. To the dark space beneath the bed. Something was wrong. The shadows there were too thick. Too deep. It was almost as if the darkness under the bed was darker than the rest of the room, like it didn't belong. Lisa's fingers trembled as she reached for the switch and flicked on the bedside lamp. Warm light flooded the room, banishing the thick shadows in an instant. Everything looked normal. The room, the bed, the floor. Nothing was out of place. Lisa let out a slow breath, feeling a wave of embarrassment creep over her. She was letting Sophie's stories get to her. There was nothing under the bed. There never was. And then, Sophie shifted. Her body tensed for a second before she turned slightly, her face still partially buried in the pillow. Lisa leaned in to pull the blanket higher over her daughter, but Dana. Sophie whispered. A tiny, breathless sound. So soft. So fragile. Lisa froze. Because Sophie wasn't whispering in her sleep. She was awake. And what she said made Lisa's blood turn to ice. "Mommy, broken bar, it's awake." Lisa felt her heartbeat hammer against her ribs. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What's awake, sweetie?" she whispered back, barely able to get the words out. Sophie's little fingers gripped the blanket tighter. She didn't answer right away. Her breathing had changed, shallow and quick, like she was too scared to even speak. Then, in the smallest, most fragile voice, she whispered, "The other me." Lisa's stomach twisted. Her skin broke out in cold, tingling goosebumps. She felt it now. The shift in the air. The weight of something unseen. She didn't want to look. She shouldn't look. But her body moved on its own. Slowly, trembling, she turned her head. Her eyes drifted downward. And beneath the bed, in the thick, unnatural darkness, something moved. Lisa barely had time to process what she was seeing before Rhea. It blinked. Two small, gleaming eyes. Staring straight at her. Wide. Unblinking. And worst of all, they were Sophie's eyes. A choked gasp caught in Lisa's throat. The thing under the bed didn't move. It only stared, its face hidden in the unnatural blackness beneath the bed frame. But the eyes, a broken bar, they were unmistakable. A perfect copy of Sophie's. Lisa felt a deep, primal terror settle into her bones. She wanted to run. To grab Sophie and run out of that house and never look back. But she couldn't move. The thing under the bed smiled. A slow, deliberate curl of its lips. And in that instant, Lisa knew. Sophie had been telling the truth all along. There was something under the bed. And it looked just like her. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Her body was frozen, every muscle locked in place as she stared into the darkness beneath the bed. The thing staring back at her, those eyes, those impossible, identical eyes belonged to Sophie. But it wasn't Sophie. She wanted to scream, to reach for her daughter and pull her away from the bed, away from it. But her body refused to move. Then, the thing under the bed moved. It didn't growl. It didn't scuttle. It slid. A slow, sickening motion, its face never breaking eye contact, its lips still curled into that unnatural, knowing smile. Lisa's stomach lurched. She gripped the edge of Sophie's blanket, instinctively pulling it closer to her daughter as if the thin fabric could protect her from whatever that thing was. Then, a sound. A whisper. But it wasn't coming from the thing under the bed. It was coming from Sophie. Lisa's head snapped back to her daughter. Sophie was still curled beneath the blankets, her eyes shut tight, her lips moving rapidly. Whispering. Lisa leaned in, her heart hammering. "Sophie, baby, what are you saying?" Sophie squeezed her eyes tighter, her tiny hands gripping the blanket so hard her knuckles turned white. "It knows we see it." Lisa's stomach dropped. And then a hand shot out from under the bed. Pale. Small. just like Sophie's hand. But the fingers were too long. The nails too sharp. The skin of broken bars stretched too tightly over the bones. It grabbed Lisa's wrist. Ice-cold fingers wrapped around her skin, too strong for something so small. A grip that felt hungry. Lisa screamed. She yanked her arm back, falling against Sophie's bed as she kicked at the floor, scrambling away. Her chest heaved, her heart slamming against her ribs. The thing under the bed of broken bar, it was laughing. A soft, breathy giggle. Sophie's giggle. But twisted. Warped. Like someone had taken her daughter's laughter and stretched it into something wrong. Lisa grabbed Sophie, lifting her into her arms. The girl was shaking, burying her face into Lisa's neck. Then, the bed shifted. Not much. Just a little. Just enough. Enough to tell Lisa one horrifying truth. It was coming out. Lisa bolted for the door. She didn't look back. She didn't care if she was dreaming, if she was losing her mind. Whatever was under that bed, it was real. And it was trying to take her daughter. She ran down the hall, Sophie clinging to her. Every step felt too slow, as if the air had turned to sludge around her. Lena. A creak. The sound of something stepping onto the floor behind her. Lisa's breath hitched. She reached the master bedroom and slammed the door shut behind her. Mark jolted awake. Lisa? What the hell? Lisa didn't wait. She locked the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Something is in her room. Mark frowned, groggy and confused. What? What are you talking about? Lisa didn't answer. Because she could hear it. On the other side of the door. A soft, slow scratching against the wood. And then, in a small, familiar voice, Sia. Mommy broken bar, let me in. Lisa's entire body went cold. Because Sophie was in her arms. Shaking. Crying. But the voice on the other side of the door was Sophie's voice too. Mark sat up, his face paling. He had heard it too. The voice came again, more insistent this time. Mommy broken bar, it's cold out here. Lisa gripped Sophie tighter. Her husband moved toward the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Lisa lunged. Don't. She gasped, pulling him back. That's not Sophie. Mark stared at her like she was crazy. But Lena. The scratching stopped. Silence. Lena. The handle turned. Jiggled. The door shook as something pushed against it from the other side. Mark paled. What the hell is that? Lisa pressed herself against the door, holding it shut. I told you, she whispered. It looks like her. Lena. A whisper. So soft. So close. Right on the other side of the wood. Let me in, Mommy. Please. I want to sleep in your bed. Lisa squeezed her eyes shut. Tears burned in them. Sophie always asked that. The real Sophie. But the thing outside the door wasn't her. Mark backed away. His hands were shaking now too. For a long moment, the thing on the other side stood there. Waiting. Lena. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Walking away. Lisa held her breath. Listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. But Lena. A single, horrifying sentence. Spoken in Sophie's voice. You have the wrong one. Lisa's heart nearly stopped. Lena. The sound of something crawling. Fast. Back towards Sophie's room. Lisa and Mark sat in frozen terror, their daughter whimpering in her arms. Then, after what felt like forever, the house was quiet again. But they knew. Somewhere, in the dark, beneath that beta. It was still there. And it was waiting. Lisa couldn't sleep. Even with Mark beside her and Sophie curled up between them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Still waiting. She kept staring at the bedroom door, expecting to hear those tiny, shuffling footsteps again. Expecting the handle to turn. Expecting that whisper Sophie's whisper to creep through the cracks of the wood. But nothing came. Only silence. A deep, suffocating silence that felt more unnatural than any sound. Mark was awake too. She could feel it in the way he lay still, his breath too controlled. He was listening, just like she was. Waiting. Neither of them spoke. They couldn't. Because what could they say? That their daughter had been duplicated. That something unnatural was hiding under her bed, mimicking her voice, her face. That it had followed them. The clock on the nightstand glowed 3:47 a.m. It felt like the night would never end. And then Sophie moved. Lisa barely had time to react before her daughter sat up between them. She didn't stir, didn't stretch or yawn. Just sat straight up, her tiny back stiff, her head slightly tilted forward. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "Sophie broken bar?" she whispered. No answer. Mark sat up too, rubbing his eyes. "Baby? What's wrong?" Sophie didn't respond. Her little hands sat in her lap, fingers twitching slightly. Lisa reached out to touch her daughter's shoulder. And Sophie screamed. Not a child's scream. Not one of fear or pain. This scream was distorted. Twisted. Like something else was inside her. Lisa and Mark jumped back as Sophie's tiny body convulsed, her spine arching at an unnatural angle. Her hands twitched, her lips moving rapidly, whispering something too fast for Lisa to understand. Lisa grabbed her daughter, shaking her. "Sophie. Sophie, wake up." But Sophie's head snapped toward her so fast it was inhuman. And then she smiled. Lisa froze. That wasn't Sophie's smile. It was too wide. Too a broken bar knowing. Lisa's entire body locked up as her daughter's head tilted too far to one side, eyes unblinking. And then, in a soft, wrong voice, Sophie whispered, "Mommy, broken bar, you took the wrong one." Lisa's blood turned to ice. Mark grabbed Sophie, shaking her. "Sophie. Wake up. What's wrong with you?" Sophie's lips twitched, her fake smile faltering for just a second. "Lena." She blinked. And just like that, she was back. A scared little girl. Trembling. Crying. Lisa clutched her daughter against her chest, her own heartbeat erratic. Mark pulled them both close, his face pale. Sophie sobbed. "It was me, Mommy," she gasped between hiccups. "I was under the bed. It took me. It took me and left the wrong one." Lisa felt her breath hitch. "Baby, what do you mean? You're here. You're safe." But Sophie just kept crying. "No, Mommy," she whispered. "You don't understand." Lisa looked into her daughter's tear-streaked face, heart hammering. "Understand what?" Sophie shivered, curling into Lisa's arms. Then, in the softest, most broken voice, "I don't think I'm me anymore." A deep, gut-wrenching silence fell over the room. Mark and Lisa stared at each other, their daughter shaking between them. Because they knew. Somewhere in the dark, beneath that old wooden beta, something was grinning. Waiting. Watching. Because it wasn't just about copying. It could replace. And if that was true, then the real question was terrifyingly simple. Who had they just brought into their bed?